Winston Sanks.
Hello.
Again, thank you for being so patient.
I'm humbled to be here. Thank you
We are
for
humbled
having
to
me.
have you. We are humbled to have you. So there's what has been new? What has been up?
I've been accepted to law school.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes.
I will be going to Orange County, just south of Los Angeles. It's called Chapman University.
Yeah.
It's a private school, and there are many opportunities to have relationships with several of the entities that I hope to be able to progress toward some of the goals I've shared with you before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So law school was a plan that you had leading towards was something specific, political. Essentially, you want to be in the political sphere.
I will submit my candidacy for the United States Senate in the state of California.
Right. So what piqued that specific interest?
I was told to do it. You
were told?
Yes. It's a common trope in my life.
Okay.
Essentially, there are reasons that I wanted to become an Air Force officer originally. Mm-hmm. So I have a passion for airmen. I feel that the men and women who put their name on the line, who put their lives potentially at risk, such that the remainder of the society can live happily, safely, I have a great deal of respect for those men and women. Right. And I wanted to be able to ensure that they have everything they need to do their jobs well. They are the guardians, and I want to support them in any way I can.
Sure.
At the same time, I recognize now, after having served my term in the military, there are many people who act in that role across our society.
Right.
And not just officially in the military. They're guardians here at the Holt International Business School, making sure that we are safe and cleanly. Ben cool nose downstairs with little lingo.
Yeah.
I want to help all those who help us.
Right. So is it like, did you feel, so you said that you were kind of told to do it. So were you told by like your parents? Were you told by your community? Were you told, like, what did you mean by that?
I was told by my parents.
Your parents. Because as you mentioned before, they were also kind of in that world.
That's right. That's true.
So how long were you in that world?
I don't remember not being in it.
Right.
So the nexus of aerospace, particularly growing up in Colorado Springs, so Boeing, Lockheed Martin, L3, all major aerospace companies have a headquarters in Colorado Springs. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Air Force Academy is there. Schriever Air Force Base is there. The North American Aerospace Defense Command is there, which is a command center in a mountain that's impervious from nuclear attack. All of those things combined, I watch the Air Force Academy graduation every year. Mm. B-2 bombers flew over my house regularly. Mm. I grew up loving aerospace. So all of those things combined have a very important impact in the political sphere, particularly because they're all national defense related. Yeah. So I've always been steeped in that.
So, you know, what's interesting is we're trying to follow a theme here that is kind of directed towards, you know, happiness. The inspiration essentially is just Chris Gardner. You know, a lot of our team and us have been very inspired. I mean, we're in a business school, so it comes as no surprise. But what might be kind of like a unlikely theme for business students is that idea of the pursuit of happiness, right? Maybe not for all, but in a materialistic world, that idea of the pursuit of happiness and what that looks like.
If I may humbly potentially interject here, I would state that I don't believe that is in any way a divergent interest, happiness.
Not at all.
And material success. In fact, happiness is simply the best arrangement of molecules.
So that's what I was going to ask you, right? So so what I was trying to say was like there's that idea that it is separate. So we are essentially just asking ourselves, and we're asking, so we'll ask you, do you believe it's separate? You kind of answered that. So do you believe it's separate? What are your thoughts around that idea of pursuing happiness? And do you think there's any ideal path towards that? Do you think that idea of happiness varies in interpretation or in action, or like, what are your thoughts around that?
So I am very grateful to have this conversation. And I suppose that's something I say quite a bit, but it's the truth.
It's good to be grateful.
I don't take it for granted.
Good.
The topic is actually one that I've currently doing research on, and from a religious standpoint.
Right.
So I believe I mentioned I'm currently pursuing being ordained as a priest.
Yes.
And I have been doing research within the Bhagavad Gita of India, the Dhammapada of Buddhism, the Tao Te Ching, the Analects of Confucius, the Holy Quran, the Holy Bible, the Talmud. I'm finding recurring themes, and in addition, the works of L. Ron Hubbard,
Right.
the Church of Scientology.
Yes.
The idea that we have certain aspects of our life that can make us happy. So, for example, we all need food, and food creates certain biochemicals in our brain that impact our mood. It's an essential aspect of our physiology. So, to the argument that material abundance can't necessarily make happiness, I suppose there's some validity in that, but they can never be completely disconnected,
Right.
in my humble opinion.
You say so that's interesting that you said that, because I'm assuming that you're talking about essentially the kind of gradient nature of happiness, how food is probably one of the most fundamental and essential. Is it a necessary precondition for happiness? Because you mentioned, for example, Buddhism. You have a lot of Buddhist monks and holy figures who fast, right? Who negate that fundamental need. So what do you think about that?
In these texts, you're absolutely right. And fasting happens to be one of the fundamental recurring themes I've seen in religion, to include the Baha'i faith.
Including the Baha'i faith, yes.
And which is a few answered questions has been a very interesting read.
Good, I'm glad.
Thank you. I will say, yes, the Desert Fathers of the early Christian church, they did everything they could to reduce their dependence on anything material. They would live in the desert, and people would visit them and say, "Father, what do I do about this and that?" And their answer was always, reduce your dependence on anything material.
Right.
I don't think that's what Jesus thought, though, in my humble opinion. Jesus Christ, and not to look to him only, of course, there are many individuals we could speak about.
As a figure.
Yes. Yeah. We are inherently material beings. Nothing we do is in any way removed from our physical occupation of space and time. Yeah. So our will to power, as Friedrich Nietzsche also writes about Jesus Christ quite a bit, right. and he argues Jesus Christ is essentially allowing us to produce our will in the world. And how do we manifest that? It's only through material means. Our voices through these radio waves are electromagnetic. It's physical. Our impact on others' thoughts, they're governed by neural impulses and biochemicals again.
Right.
Everything that happens is physical, so we can't be disconnected from it.
So where does the immaterial, so there may be a physical interpretation of a non-physical experience. So you can quantify, for example, happiness as dopamine or serotonin or this or that, a momentary increase in a certain biochemical. But there's also that experience that is not solely physical or physiological, in the sense that, you win a game, you're playing video games and you win, and you have that momentary feeling of happiness. And there's also that feeling of happiness when you watch your child walk for the first time. It's both the same chemicals, but it's hardly the same experience. So what are your thoughts on that?
I would go to Aristotle and his brain in a vat argument. So if indeed we are reducing every human experience, or every experience for a sentient being, we can simply just take our brain out of a vat and give it the impulses it wants to be satisfied. And Aristotle argues that that's not really life. And I would argue the same.
Yeah.
The person who's watching his or her son or daughter take their first step and being proud of that experience and being in a safe neighborhood where that's happening, having comfort and confidence that there's food in the fridge and that the electricity won't go out. All of these material foundations for that experience, I humbly argue that they are all requisite.
Right. That's good. That's interesting, because when we're kind of delving into this idea of happiness, it's very easy to become a reductionist in a sense. It's very easy to say there are a lot of figures that business students look up to. One of them is that character from The Wolf of Wall Street.
Of course.
And, he said he had a very interesting quote where he essentially...
I've been a rich man, and I've been a poor man,
exactly.
and I choose rich every time.
Exactly.
Yes, I know.
And he says it's better, and he thinks it's better to be rich, and unhappy, than to be poor and unhappy, right? So there is a certain dichotomy that exists in the way we interpret happiness, because people are okay with being sad as long as they don't have to be sad all the time. So we're talking about happiness and pursuing happiness and becoming happy, but do we maybe misconstrue that with a constant state of contentment? Because happiness, like any emotion, as we're talking about, comes and goes. Contentment doesn't have to necessarily come and go. It's something you train. It actually reminds me of a story that my father told me when I was younger. It has to do with contentment and detachment, that idea, where there was this dervish, this kind of like wayfarer, who had basically nothing, a stick and a bag, and the clothes on his back. And he would go around preaching and talking about detachment, and how detachment and the rejection of material possession is the key and way to happiness. And he was so renowned that the king finally called for him to his court and said that he is very unhappy and he wishes to be taught to be happy. And the dervish essentially said, well, you have everything. So, you have to detach yourself from everything. You have to leave everything behind, and you have to live by your own two hands, by what you have, essentially, what you are. And you have to find that, and you have to, you had the whole shtick. And on their way out of the gates of the city, the king had kind of like relinquished everything, and is following this man basically into the unknown. The dervish stops and goes, "We can't go further. We have to go back." And the king says, "What? But why?" He goes, "I forgot my bag." And the king looks at him and says, "I just relinquished a whole kingdom, all the riches, all the power, and you want to go back for your bag?" And that's the end of the story. But it was so interesting because even in that pursuit of happiness, there is that attachment to the pursuit of happiness. And maybe that is the fundamental, in philosophical terms, non sequitur, right? Our premise is probably, at least I believe in the Western world, wrong in that idea that you have to pursue it rather than cultivate it. So what do you think about that?
That is fascinating. I've not heard that story before.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I liked it. It stuck with me, clearly.
The king was happy. He simply wanted somebody to show him.
Another version of maybe that happiness.
The fact that he had everything he already wanted.
Right.
So, what is it that he really wanted? At the risk of potentially simply exchanging old folk tales.
No, go ahead.
So King Creon, King Croesus, of richest Croesus fame, he spoke with Solon, who's one of the wise men of Athens, one of the lawgivers.
Right.
And he wanted to know who was the happiest of men. Solon said, well, Cleobus and Biton.
Right.
And obviously the king was expecting to hear his own name, but he says, oh, okay, who are Cleobus and Biton? And Solon says, well, Cleobus and Biton are two sons of a priestess in Athens, and the priestess, was late for her appointment at the temple of Athena. And as a result, her sons yoked themselves to the oxen cart,
right,
and brought their mother to the temple about 3 miles away, and they were exhausted at the end of this trip. And in their exhaustion, they went to lay down under a tree. Their mother was able to go to the temple, offer the rites, and asked the god to make sure that her sons died the happiest of men. And there, while they slept under the tree, Cleobus and Biton died. So Solon says that these two men were the happiest of men because they died with a good reputation. So the whole community saw what they had done for their mother, and there was something fundamentally decent about it. They didn't die in war. There was nothing valoric about what they did.
Right.
But it was beneficial to the community. It served the best possible end for their mom.
Right.
This is what Solon defines as happiness. And I suppose that the king you mentioned might have wanted that too.
Right.
A good reputation.
Right. It's essentially also the that's very good, because that's interestingly the sparking kind of like force behind a lot of great people in history. You have Marcus Aurelius saying he doesn't want to be remembered as a tyrant, right? But rather a philosophical ruler, a philosophical king. Even someone like Alexander the Great, who essentially has that notion of wanting to be remembered as such and such. Do you think that it's only people with great ambition that want to be remembered in some form or another? Or do you think everyone on some level wants to be remembered as something valuable? And that's essentially what they're kind of looking for. It would explain the obsession with social media, at least. Right?
I think you're right.
You want to be looked at and remembered and thought of as a certain thing that you might not be or you might be. But that's essentially the chase, right? So do you think that's maybe still a very strong force with young people or with people who are in business school or whatever it may be? Do you think that's healthy, or do you think that's fine or not fine? Like what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's inevitable. I think that the common arc, and I think you brought up that excellent point. What can we do to be important, honored? And yes, in our own spheres, pardon me, not all of us have 4.0 GPAs. Right. Not everyone is a world-class athlete. Not all of us can aspire to have our own Wikipedia page.
Right.
So what is it that we can do to be remembered? And I would argue then what we do in the community is we cleave ourselves to something important. To something that's great for the community. Yeah. So that's a good segue to, you say that you have recently become part of, finish my sentence. The Freemasons? The Freemasons. Okay. Yes. So please tell me a little bit about that. How does this your idea, for example, about finding happiness and contentment and purpose merge with, these various things? You're part of a lot of different, ambitions and goals and circles and communities. So how does these two how does that connect with your ideas of happiness and purpose? And I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak about these organizations that I've been fortunate to join. I've been a member of the Freemasons beginning in October of last year. That's when I was accepted to receive the first degree. I received the final introduction degree, so I'm considered a full member now as of yesterday evening. And I'm learning now many of the rites and important doctrines of Masonry, and
Right.
and this is in my humble opinion, and with what I can share, it boils down to trust and brotherhood.
Right.
So, what is it that I can do for you, Nayyer, to make sure that you get to where you need to go? That is what I have to occupy myself with, my time. Mason, non-Mason, it doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially a volunteer organization, and the only reason they exist is finding ways to help other people do what they want.
Mm-hmm.
It's odd.
So, okay, that's interesting because a lot of the time people don't know what they want. So that's very interesting because you could argue that certainly it is a very much needed and noble purpose to aid people in that pursuit of, what is it that you want. I'm sure it's very hard to pursue happiness if you don't even know what you want. You don't know what happiness looks like, right? A lot of people are even afraid to define what is failure, because that means you have to define what is success, and then that means you have to notice when you're failing, right? So you're stagnated essentially at that point. Based on where you are now and the things that you're part of, what are some misconceptions do you think people have about the fundamental nature of happiness?
Happiness is when I am served. If I get the promotion and I win, if I beat the video game, if it is my child that is taking the first steps, I will be happy.
Right.
I'm starting to see the opposite. And then they're not mutually exclusive. Happiness is when Nayyer's child is taking his first step.
So essentially it's just that, so you believe the misconception is in the fact that people think about themselves.
Right.
They're the center of the pursuit of happiness rather than someone else.
Everyone else.
It's interesting. So what would you then advise, say an 18, 19, 20-something year old, should be a fundamental mindset in their pursuit for happiness?
Buy my book.
Okay. What is your book?
It's called Protect and to Serve.
Okay.
And in that book, I make the argument that is essentially what we are charged in many of these long-standing ethical traditions to do. Protect your community, protect your family, protect your spouse, serve your community, serve your family, serve your spouse, serve your country, protect and to serve. That is the path to being happy.
Do you think there's a risk to kind of being connected to so you said something interesting, you said that serve your country. That's a very American notion. Well, it's not just American, obviously, but I would say if you say the word patriotism, one of the first countries and nationalities that would come to mind for anybody is American, right? So do you think that patriotism, has the same importance and place today as it did, say, in 1945?
That's a good question. And I will acknowledge that I know we're running out of time, so I will keep my answer brief. There's a story, and at the Air Force Academy, we study quite a bit of classical philosophy and classical history. So there's a story in Sparta. There's a mother who sends 5 of her sons to war and anxiously waits for word on the outskirts of the city of the battle. And somebody returns and tells her that her sons had met death. And she responds to this individual, "I didn't ask about that, you vile varlet. How fares our country?"
Right.
So, in the Spartan mind, the purpose of the individual and the family is to serve the state, is to serve the community, to make sure everyone else is safe.
Right.
For me personally, I can say the same thing. There are airmen I know, Patricia Pask and Garrett Chapman and Taylor Joel Shagan and Taylor Bai, who recently landed an A-10 without gear due to a malfunction.
Yeah.
these are men and women that I would die for if needed. So I think that serving them is serving my country.
Yeah. So, what do you think? And this is a segue. What do you think, in a sentence, is your favorite or the thing that has caught you most in terms of interest reading Edward Hubbard's Scientology? What has caught you? What has caught your interest, and do you feel that there's anything that applies to the way you're going to live your life, or are you reading it with the ready intent of changing something about yourself or the way you believe something? Where are you with that? Start with what's most interesting for you.
Well, Scientology is a fascinating topic.
Right.
And there is one interesting topic upon which everything else is built. Scientology argues that the point of life is to survive. That's what gets you happiness. There was a story about this wise king in Alexandria who had the whole library of Alexandria. So he had all his scribes read every book and then asked him to summarize all of those books in one book. Then he asked those scribes to summarize that book into one chapter, that chapter into one sentence, that sentence into one word. And that word was survive. And upon this is what L. Ron Hubbard argues. This is what brings us happiness and joy. Survival of the self. It's the same topic we've just spoken about. Survival of the self, survival of the family, survival of the town, survival of the nation, survival of the nations, survival of all sentient beings, survival of the idea that we are doing something here, not harming anything.
So then, with that same thought process, to close, summarize your book in a sentence or in a word.
My book, and thank you for the opportunity to promote, is we don't live very long. So King Solomon, what he did with his power in his time was to build something wherein he would be remembered. Everybody rallied around him for that. They built the Temple of Solomon, and we're still talking about it today. That's why temples are built in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's why we built cathedrals. That's why banks build skyscrapers. That's why we do anything. Very similar to what you had mentioned.
Yeah.
And for me, I want to build a space elevator.
Yeah.
That's my thing. That's my temple. And for anyone who doesn't know what their temple is yet, start with protecting and serving. I think that'll lead you there.
Fantastic. Great conversation. Great talking to you again. We established a lot of interesting ideas and beliefs. And hopefully when we have you again next, we'll talk about interesting actions and interesting projects.
I'm humbled that I would be invited for a third date. Thank you.
Of course.
Nayyer.
Thank you so much, Winston.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Maybe that was presumptuous. Maybe I'm not invited for a
You are. Certainly.